What an inspiring talk to start Outlier 2022 with. There are already some questions in the chat, but do feel free to add more because I'm about to bring our speakers to the stage. Hi, Becky. Hi, Ana Lucia. How are you doing?
Hello.
For those of you watching us from home, Sean was unfortunately unable to join us today. However, don't worry, if you have specific questions for him, he will be monitoring the talk notes document, so you will totally be able to pick his brain on these projects as well. So where are you joining us from this morning, Becky and Ana Lucia?
I'm coming from Brighton in the UK.
Yes, and I'm in Southeast London from my kitchen.
Nice. There seems to be a nice bright light for you, like you at this on
Oh,
this
it's
month
definitely
of February.
raining outside.
It's raining.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, at least we've got Outlier to brighten our day. Are you ready for the questions?
Yeah.
Okay. First question. In the Biden-Trump slide, where the text was presented from right to left, do you also read the numbers from right to left too? That is, for Biden, it is 25 or 52. Is it 25 or 52?
Yes. So I answered in the talk just so that you can see the links, but it really depends on the language. So for Turkish, for example, it's because they add the percent sign to the left of the number rather than to the right, like most of the languages do. So it would be 52% in this case. But then for Arabic, they use Latin numerals. So even though you're reading it right to left, you would still have it to the right. And then for Persian, they still follow the right to left structure. So you do the number and then to the left the percent sign. I always get it wrong. So always check with someone who actually writes or speaks the language.
Okay, amazing. Next question. For dates in the calendar, do you store them as UTC or local? I'm not exactly sure what calendar they mean, but it's probably one of the ones at the beginning of your talk.
Yeah, I assume it's one of the ones at the beginning. So the way we build that is that we have one data set with all the dates just in like English, England, new location, and then we use a combination of to locale string and a custom date config to convert them all into local dates. So local, I guess, is the answer to that.
Okay, very cool. And how did you choose 40 languages out of all languages? The person who asked the question says that it's probably relatively easy to pick 10 languages, but how do you prioritize some languages over others?
It is 40 because so the BBC World Service has 40 what we call language services or language websites. This is more of a BBC question. It's how the Foreign Office and the BBC decide which countries are priorities and which audiences are a priority. But now it's 40, and this is the only interactive that has gone out in 40 languages because COVID was such a big story. We usually have 20, 25, depending on the project, and we don't. To be honest, sometimes if we're really stuck on time, we prioritize on the big ones. But I've never had a project where we said, no, you're too small, you can't. We cater for everyone because the devs have set it up in such a brilliant way that it's just a translation spreadsheet, so anyone can translate. Anyone who does the work of translating, which is a huge work, is in.
Okay, so a bit of a follow-up question on that. Someone is wondering how many people work on the different aspects of this project: performance, accessibility, SEO, translations that you have just mentioned. Is everybody involved in all aspects?
So Becky first, I think.
Yeah. So I guess on a standard project, you'll have one or two developers, one or two designers, one or two journalists, and then it goes out to more translations. We have representatives from the World Service side as well. So you'd usually have about up to 8 core people working on the project, and then it spreads out to more translators. But in the case of the COVID one, because it was over such a long period of time, nearly every developer in the team worked on it. I assume nearly every World Service journalist worked on it. I'm not entirely sure. I don't know what you have to add to that, Ana Lucia.
just that we have people that we know are good at handling spreadsheets, etc. This is journalists that translate, because obviously there's a lot of editorial things to consider as well. But also have in mind that this was April 2020. So we're very proud of this project because this was from kitchen tops. Everyone was working from home. People didn't have the right equipment, and it still went live, and people still work very hard on this until, I'm not proud that we're light in the night, but it was one of these projects that we put our heart on.
Yeah, it's very impressive. And speaking of impressive, I don't know if you saw, but there are so many comments in the chat. A lot of people saying that this is very, very cool and very impressive. So I think you will inspire a lot of DataViz developers. The next question we've got actually came from Lloyd, who's the app and web developer who made the amazing schedule app for Outlier 2022 that you're all using. So here's a question. For the Outlier schedule app, we wanted to include localization for as many languages as possible. Well, we have an international team, including French, Polish, Chinese people, and more. We still weren't able to find native speakers for everyone, and so had to rely on translation services for some, like Arabic, Czech, Russian, etc. Do you think it's more important to provide localization only when involving native speakers, or what compromises can smaller dev teams do to still make their work accessible to as many people as possible?
That is
Well,
actually a very good question, right? So, Becky.
I was going to say, I'm not sure about is it only worth it when you have local people on the ground? In terms of compromises, I really like that the schedule is localized to your time zone. One of our developers in our team, who's based in Delhi, is joining today, and she was like, "Oh, it's at 3:00 my time," and I said, "Oh, that's really helpful," because we've been trying to figure it all out. So it's things like that, yeah, great little touches. In terms of translations, you could always crowdsource stuff. A lot of things that kind of take the open source approach and put it out to the community and get people involved that way. Obviously, you then have to figure out a way to double check it, but it at least gets you 3/4 of the way there. Don't know about what your thoughts are, Lucia.
I don't know. This is an ongoing discussion, because with word service, there's always someone that comes up with, we'll just use translation services, and then journalists get very, sensitive about this. But I think, any efforts to localize things are brilliant. You just have to bear in mind that for some languages, Google, let's talk about, for example, Google Translate. For some languages, it's brilliant, and for some languages, it's not. So I guess you kind of balance that. Yeah, that would be my answer. But again, it is tricky and an ongoing discussion. But I see any efforts to localize things, I would go for it.
Okay, yeah, that's a really, really good piece of advice. And actually, when we created our app, people were so used to having to translate their time zones from one another. They kept asking us, what time zone is it? And we kept telling them, it's your own time zone. You can just save it and bookmark it and join the conference at that time. Okay, so I have 9 minutes left and quite a few questions coming in. So let's try to cover a few more. For screen reader users, what tools do you use to test your projects? And do you do real user testing with visually impaired people?
We don't manage to do real user testing very often at all. We don't really have the resources to do that. It is something we'd really like to do if we could. What we usually do as a very basic is to use, we work on Macs, so we use Safari and VoiceOver mainly. And then our testers do have access to JAWS and NVDA, so they try and use those, and Windows machines and things, so they try and do a bit more comprehensive testing where possible, and particularly on bigger projects.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. It's probably a bit difficult to set up, especially in this context. Okay, so there are a couple of questions that are related, so I'll just group them together. Until the day when code knows all language quirks comes, are there any style guides or references that compile these insights for each country and language? Has BBC considered making something like this public? So any open documentation on your end?
No. But it's a great idea. We really should do something like that. That would be good for us just to remember what we've done. And yeah, great to put into the community. I'd be well up for working on something like that.
I know that I don't know exactly which team it is, but you do have a public DataViz style guide that is kind of famous in the DataViz world. So maybe you can have an accessibility one as well.
Yeah, that's a really nice idea. Yeah, definitely something that we should look into a bit more.
Okay. Next question. So the person who has the question first wants to say that it was a very interesting talk. So I just want you to know. The question is, what are some generally applicable lessons that you learned from the projects of adapting DataViz and interfaces for new languages or language families?
I mean, from my point of view, only because I deal mostly with text, you kind of become an expert in, like, as you say, language families. So things like double space for Hindi and all that family of languages and things like that. And we always start a project thinking of right to left intrinsically, for example. We don't leave it till the end to localize. Becky probably has more insight on this.
No, kind of similar actually. Like, yeah, we consider these things much earlier on now. I think we very much don't try and tack it in at the end. Consider all the little quirks from the get-go that might catch you out. Well, a style guide would probably be useful. Yeah, I don't know. Because a lot of these things we've kind of developed over time anyway on previous projects, like making sure our assets are small, making sure we have content up front. But yeah, I think what Anne Lucia said really.
Yeah, there are very tricky languages, and I don't want to call them tricky languages because that's a bit unfair. But for example, we have Burmese, and the BBC has a long experience with Burmese, and actually someone developed a special keyboard so that they can input, their language and create the characters, for example. So we do have expertise in like certain languages that are unusually tricky and not supported by most of the companies that supply software.
Okay, thank you for those insights. A design question is next. Can you talk about design and scale with languages taking up different amount of space on the screen? Have you had a topic or project that was especially challenging around that? And the third part of the question is, do you have a guide for working with individual languages to anticipate this? But I guess we've covered this already. So different languages, different amount of space. How do you go about it?
We've definitely encountered different languages and different amount of space, particularly when you're doing charts. And some languages obviously use 3 words, but other would use 1. So that's been something we have to bear in mind at design stage. Obviously we don't have Sean with us today, so he can't go into depth about it. Hopefully he'll be able to update the answer in the question. But it's a lot about identifying the longer worded languages early up front when we're doing the designs, and just making sure the designs can handle those, and doing kind of a bit of testing around that visually before we start development.
Yeah, you're right. Actually, what we do is we usually ask for some Arabic and Russian text from the beginning so that we can test as we are going, because we know Russian is particularly long.
And Arabic provides us with right to left, yes.
Yeah. On more than the design, because again, that's a question for Sean, but on language, for example, any project that is very smart and introduces, when you generate sentences with like numbers and words and that I've learned the hard way, that is particularly difficult to tackle.
Okay. So when listening to you, I can't help but wonder, how do you manage to do all of this work in such a fast-paced environment that is the news industry? Because it does sound like you spend quite a lot of time on these projects.
Yeah. I think that's the crux of that's where the multidisciplinary approach comes in, because journalists, we like everything for tomorrow, because
now
and
2 hours.
And developers, we like time to do things.
yeah, it is nice to work with developers that say, let's do it correctly. Let's do it the correct way. And it is a bit of a negotiation, I think. Not the team itself, but the editors and the higher up that usually wants things now. We've done things like providing static, like for example, the poll tracker that you saw. We provided static images first that were generated by R and were translated to languages, so that we have something while the team was building the proper interactive. And
we started taking more iterative approaches to larger scale projects like the COVID mapping table, where we'll release like an MVP, and then whilst that's out, we'll continue working on like the next phase and introduce that, and then the next phase. So that's a way of working with kind of embracing a bit more. But usually it just really comes down to communication. We spend so much time on Slack and our little team groups and on Zoom talking, and just whenever there's an issue, knowing that we can go to each other and ask for help and ask the stupid questions and all of that. It is a really nice collaborative team. I think that's kind of really what it comes down to.
All right. Let's wrap up with a bit of a fun question. So what were some things that you wish you could have gone back and done better?
Yeah, let me share the screen.
You mean on the COVID map or just like generally?
Any of your projects, I guess. It's not specified, so maybe that will help you answer, since it's not just the COVID map, but everything else.
I think for the COVID map, for me, again, I'm the editorial lead, so not the most interesting of answers, but I think no one prepared us for the COVID, the pandemic. So there are things we've had to adjust, because it's a very sad story that we've had to cater for like larger numbers, for example, and we visualize circles. And I think everyone's data visualization on COVID is now like a collection of big circles. So like we didn't take into account how big it will be, how it will take, 2 years on, we're still updating this. And it takes another team that I don't work with that they update this very frequently, and it has meant that they work weekends, they work nights, not nights, sorry, but they spend a long time updating it. So maybe I don't think there was a way to predict this, but in hindsight, just to see how this could be updated quickly and easily.
Definitely. 100%. That is something that we kind of considered a couple of times, but every time it kind of was like, oh, but how much longer are we going to need it for? And then it's like, oh, we definitely should have done that. So yeah, if we'd made it like a really nice updating solution, because a lot of there's an editorial team that have to update it every day, and there definitely could have been a way we could have automated some of that, at least, to make it a bit of an easier task. But yeah, that would have been good.
All right, well, thank you so much for all of the answers. Unfortunately, our Q&A time is up. However, there are a few questions in the document that we didn't really answer or half answered. So feel free to go back in there and just add some notes, and especially if you want to maybe add some links to the amazing work you were talking about. Thanks so much for joining us for the Q&A, and enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thanks for having us. It's been
Bye.
really fun. Bye.